From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Climate change changes everything. It changes everything because if we stay on the road we're on, it will change our physical world so much it will be unrecognizable. There's still a chance to stop this catastrophic outcome, but that involves changing most everything about our economic system. The good news is that that system isn't working for a whole lot of people.
This changes everything. Capitalism versus the climate. As over 100,000 are expected to take part in the People's Climate March Sunday, ahead of next week's UN Climate Summit, we'll spend the hour with author and activist Naomi Klein. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a rare moment of bipartisan unity, House lawmakers have voted to authorize the arming and training of Syrian rebels fighting the Islamic State. The Senate's expected to pass the legislation today. The Obama administration had lobbied heavily for the measure as part of its ramped-up offensive against the Islamic State, which has claimed swaths of both Iraq and Syria. The vote came as President Obama sought to provide reassurance the offensive will not involve ground troops in Iraq.
I want to be clear. The American forces that have been deployed to Iraq do not and will not have a combat mission. They will support Iraqi forces on the ground as they fight for their own country against these terrorists. As your commander-in-chief, I will not commit you and the rest of our armed forces to fighting another ground war in Iraq.
Obama's comments came one day after General Martin Dempsey, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, acknowledged ground troops may be needed in Iraq in the future. The Islamic State, meanwhile, has released a video that appears to warn the United States of the violent fate awaiting U.S. troops if they deploy to Iraq. It was released late Tuesday after Dempsey's comments. Secretary of State John Kerry appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing Wednesday to defend the administration's plans against the Islamic State. As he appeared on screen, Kerry was flanked by peace signs held by the group Code Pink. After referencing his own history as a peace activist against the Vietnam War, Kerry addressed the group directly, saying they should support attacking the Islamic State, also known as ISIL.
I also know something about Code Pink. Code Pink was started by a woman and women who were opposed to war, but who also thought that the government's job was to take care of people and to give them health care and education and good jobs. And if that's what you believe in, and I believe it is, then you ought to care about fighting ISIL. Because ISIL is killing and raping and mutilating women.
The deaths of several children as part of a measles vaccination program in Syria is now being attributed to a mistake, not to the tainting of vaccines as previously thought. A preliminary probe shows medics accidentally administered an anesthetic that has similar packaging to the measles vaccine. While the earlier death toll was higher, it's now being reported 15 children between the ages of 6 and 18 months have died. The Pakistani military says it's launched airstrikes in the Dadakhel region of North Waziristan, killing 40 people and identified as suspected militants. The strikes come as part of a major offensive launched in June, which coincided with the resumption of U.S. drone strikes in the region. In the Pakistani capital of Islamabad, meanwhile, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is facing continuing calls for his resignation from protesters led by former cricket star Imran Khan, who's accused Sharif of rigging last year's elections. In Nigeria, gunmen suspected of belonging to the militant group Boko Haram attacked a teacher training college in the city of Kano, killing 15 people. It's at least the second major tragedy in Nigeria in less than a week after a church guest house collapsed in Lagos on Friday, killing at least 70 people. Australian authorities say they've thwarted a plot by supporters of the Islamic State to behead a random person in Sydney. Hundreds of law enforcement officers conducted the largest raids in Australia's history, detaining 15 people. They say the suspects were called to action by an Australian high up in the ranks of Islamic State. In Scotland, voting's underway in an historic referendum to decide whether the country becomes independent or remains part of the United Kingdom. Results are expected early Friday morning. For our debate on Scottish independence from Wednesday's broadcast with British musician Billy Bragg and historian Sam Wetherill, you can go to democracynow.org. In Colombia, Senator and former President Álvaro Uribe faced questioning by lawmakers over his ties to right-wing paramilitaries. Uribe served as president from 2002 to 2010 and was considered among the strongest U.S. allies in Latin America. At one point during Wednesday's debate, Uribe stormed out of the chamber but later returned. Senator Iván Cepeda outlined the case against Uribe.
Álvaro Uribe has taken all types of decisions that in one way or the other have favored people linked to the paramilitary and drug trafficking. He has handed over licenses for hangars, planes and runways to people linked to drug trafficking. He has legalized security companies linked to or run by paramilitaries. He has defended a referendum that at the time sought to eliminate extraditions for the meddling cartel and drug trafficking organizations.
Texas has executed a woman for the starvation death of a 9-year-old boy in 2004. Lisa Ann Coleman is only the 15th woman to be executed since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, compared to nearly 1,400 men. 6 of those 15 female executions have been carried out in Texas. The U.S. Agriculture Department has approved the use of genetically modified corn and soybean seeds that are resistant to the weed killer 2,4-D. The herbicide made by Dow Chemical has been linked to a range of health risks, including cancer and Parkinson's disease. It was an ingredient in the toxic Vietnam War herbicide Agent Orange. Industrial farmers have been pressing for an alternative after many weeds grew resistant to Monsanto's Roundup-Ready weed killer. The EPA would still need to approve the newest version of 2,4-D. If it does, the use of herbicide could increase by as much as 600% in the next several years. A top Obama administration official in the Interior Department is leaving her post to head a major environmental organization. Rhea Su will take over as president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, replacing Francis Beinecke. Su had been nominated by Obama to oversee the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, but her nomination was stalled after Republicans objected to her past work with foundations that fund environmental causes. Amazon.com founder and Washington Post owner Jeff Bezos has announced a new partnership with Boeing and Lockheed Martin, 2 of the largest weapons contractors in the world. Bezos's private space company, Blue Origin, will partner with United Launch Alliance, a joint venture of the 2 weapons makers, to create rocket engines to launch military satellites. Bezos bought the Washington Post and a number of other publications last year for $250 million, less than 1% of his wealth, which at the time was estimated at $28 billion. Florida State University quarterback and Heisman Trophy winner Jameis Winston has been suspended for half a game for standing on a table and yelling an obscene remark about women. It's Winston's first suspension from the football team. He was allowed to continue playing after being accused of rape in 2012. A New York Times investigation of the case found, quote, there was virtually no investigation at all, either by the police or the university. The Tallahassee police officer who handled the sexual assault case had done private security work for the Seminole Boosters, which is the primary financial backer of sports at Florida State. Winston was later suspended from the baseball team for 3 games when he allegedly stole $32.72 worth of crab legs. A recent report by the Office of Missouri Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill found more than 1 in 5 schools give college athletic departments oversight of sexual violence cases that involve student athletes. At the professional level, another National Football League player is facing allegations of domestic violence. Arizona Cardinals running back Jonathan Dwyer was arrested for assault Wednesday for 2 incidents at his home in July. According to TV station Fox 10 in Phoenix, Arizona, the victim contacted police last week after receiving threatening text messages from Dwyer. She told police Dwyer had thrown a shoe at their 18-month-old son and thrown a cell phone from the second floor of their home as she tried to call for help. Among the charges against Dwyer is aggravated assault causing a fracture. The Cardinals said they've immediately deactivated Dwyer from all team activities. Another player accused of domestic violence, Greg Hardy, has been added to a list which bars him from practices and games. Like Adrian Peterson, the Minnesota Vikings player facing child abuse charges, Hardy will continue to receive his multi-million-dollar salary while on the list. Another NFL player has come to the defense of Peterson, who's accused of beating his 4-year-old son with a tree branch. Speaking on WFAN radio in New York, Detroit Lions running back Reggie Bush said he would also discipline his daughter harshly.
I have a 1-year-old daughter, and I discipline her, and you know, obviously every person is different, you know, and I definitely will use my best judgment to discipline her, depending on, you know, the situation, on what happens, you know. So I definitely will try to, will obviously not leave bruises or anything like that on her, but you know, I definitely will discipline her harshly, you know, depending on what, you know, what the situation is.
The issue of abuse is not restricted to the NFL. A new study finds 1 in 5 men in the United States has committed an act of domestic violence. The report, published in the Journal of the American Board of Family Medicine, found nearly 20% of men admit to pushing, grabbing, shoving, throwing something, slapping or hitting, kicking, biting, beating up, choking, burning or scalding, or threatening a partner with a knife or gun. In Oklahoma, a 3rd law enforcement officer has been accused of sexually assaulting women while on duty. Tulsa County Deputy Gerald Nichols has resigned following his arrest Tuesday for allegedly assaulting 2 women while responding to a 911 hang-up call. It's believed he may have assaulted at least 5 other victims. His arrest came a day after Oklahoma State Trooper Eric Roberts was arrested for allegedly sexually assaulting 3 women while on duty. Last month, Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw was accused of sexually assaulting 8 women, all of them African-American. And activists with the Rolling Jubilee have bought up $3.85 billion in student debt and abolished it. The group purchases debt at discounted prices by raising money through donations. The latest move lifts debt from nearly 3,000 students at Everest College, whose parent company, Corinthian Colleges, is now being sued by the federal government for predatory lending. A correction, that's $3.85 million. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Scientists from NASA have confirmed that last month was the warmest August on record globally. Much of the world, including Central Europe, Northern Africa, parts of South America, and the western portions of North America, saw much higher than normal temperatures. According to the National Climatic Data Center, August was the 354th consecutive month with a global average temperature above the 20th century average. The news comes as flooding in India and Pakistan has killed more than 400 people and displaced nearly 1 million. The flooding is the worst to hit the Kashmir region in half a century. Severe drought in Central America has left nearly 3 million people struggling to feed themselves. And California is suffering its worst drought in over a century. Meanwhile, a new report by the Norwegian Refugee Council has found more than 22 million people were displaced from their homes by extreme weather last year, more than 3 times the number of people displaced by war. In the Philippines alone, over 4 million people were displaced by Typhoon Haiyan.
On Tuesday, world leaders will gather here in New York for a one-day climate summit called for by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Climate activists have planned a series of events leading up to the UN summit. On Sunday, more than 100,000 are expected to take part in the People's Climate March here in New York. More than 2,000 People's Climate events are planned worldwide in 150 countries. On Monday, climate activists are planning to stage a mass sit-in in the financial district of New York in an action dubbed Flood Wall Street. Well, today we spend an exclusive hour with the acclaimed journalist and author Naomi Klein. She's just out with her latest book, This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. It's her first book since her 2007 bestseller, The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Before that, she wrote No Logo. Naomi Klein, welcome back to Democracy Now! Congratulations on the book. What changes everything?
Well, climate change changes everything, and it changes everything for the reasons Juan just outlined. It's already upon us, and we are on a road towards warming of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. We've reached 0.7 or 0.8 degrees Celsius, and we're already seeing these effects. Once you get to warming of that level, the models start to break down. I mean, climate scientists don't know what to expect. Things start going nonlinear, and so it changes everything about our physical world if we just simply do what we're doing and continue down this road. So the argument I'm making in the book is we do have the opportunity to get off that road, but in order to do so, we have to change pretty much everything, or some really fundamental things about our economic system. The good news is that the things we need to change, many of them are broken anyway. We need to make vast investments in the public sphere, which would create millions of good jobs. We need to invest in healthcare, in education, in the sciences. And in so doing, we will tackle one of the most intractable problems we face, which is gross wealth inequality. We can't fight climate change without dealing with inequality within our countries and between our countries. So the argument I'm making is really quite a hopeful one. I think if we do respond to climate change with the decisiveness that the scientists are telling us we do, if we respond in line with science, we have a chance to remake our economy, the global economy, for the better. But this is not going to be the kind of change that comes from below. From above. It's going to be the kind of change that is demanded by mass movements from below.
Well, Naomi, but one of the central theses of your book is that the inability so far of our society to be able to deal with climate change goes to the heart of the system. Yeah. And you say at one point, we have not done the things that are necessary to lower emissions because those things fundamentally conflict with deregulated capitalism, the reigning ideology for the entire period we've been struggling to find a way out of the crisis.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
So the book starts from the premise that the things we have done to try to address this crisis have failed. And this is not a controversial position. It can't be when we look at the numbers, and the numbers don't lie. I mean, governments started negotiating towards emission reduction in 1990. That's when the official negotiations started. And since that time, emissions have gone up by 61% globally. So it's not just that we're not solving the problem. It's that we're making it a lot worse. And in concrete terms, we see this every day. I mean, that we see the contradictory messages of those alarming reports, ever more alarming reports coming from scientists on the one hand, and on the other hand, political leaders doubling down on the dirtiest and highest risk fossil fuels. We're tearing up this continent to get at shale gas, to get at tar sands, to get at coal in mountains. We're detonating mountains. We're just going for it on the most horrendous level. So how do people even hold these contradictions in their mind? So there have been all these theories put forward about why we have failed to deal with climate change, and you often hear theories related to human nature. We just can't deal with a crisis that's far off in the future, or the political system is blamed, that politicians think short term and this is a long-term crisis. I'm putting forward a different theory, and that theory is, okay, all of these other things play a part, but the biggest problem is that this crisis landed on our laps at the worst possible historical moment. James Hansen testified before Congress in 1988. That was and he said that he could now decisively make the link between carbon emissions and warming. That was the moment when we lost all plausible deniability. Scientists knew beforehand, but this was the moment where it became the mainstream issue. That year when the editors of Time magazine had to choose their man of the year, they were still calling it a man of the year then, they chose Planet Earth and put Planet Earth on the cover. That was the kind of consciousness that was rising. So what I do in the book is I ask, okay, What else was happening in 1988? Well, the free trade deal between Canada and the U.S. was signed, a historic moment in the advance of corporate globalization. And the next year, the Berlin Wall collapsed. Francis Fukuyama is declaring history over. This was, this in many ways is the story I told in the shock doctrine of how that triumphant ideology of market fundamentalism, as Joseph Stiglitz called it, swept the world. This was the moment when they declared victory, and there was no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher used to say. So the problem we had is that we have the essence of a collective problem. We can only solve it with real regulation, making the polluters pay, telling them they can't dig the carbon out of the ground. And we need to come together collectively to respond to this crisis. We need to invest in the public sphere. But it hits us at the precise moment when all of these things become non-starters. You have to cut back the public sphere. You can't regulate. You have to embrace pure laissez-faire economics. And so the argument I'm making is we cannot solve this crisis without a profound ideological shift.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Naomi Klein is with us for the hour. Her latest book, This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. Stay with us. The history of climate change negotiations in 83 seconds. And if you're listening on the radio, check it out at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, when Democracy Now! Was at the 2011 UN Climate Change Conference in Durban, Amy spoke with Mark Morano, publisher of the Climate Depot, a website run by the climate denier group Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. She asked him about President Obama's record on climate change.
His nickname is George W. Obama. Obama's negotiator, Todd Stern, will be here today. They have kept the exact same principles and negotiating stance as President George Bush did for 8 years. Obama has carried on Bush's legacy. So as skeptics, we tip our hat to President Obama in helping crush and continue to defeat the United Nations process. Obama has been a great friend of global warming skeptics at these conferences. Obama has problems, for us because he's going through it through the EPA regulatory process, which is a grave threat. But in terms of this, President Obama could not have turned out better when it came to his lack of interest in a congressional climate bill and his lack of interest in the United Nations Kyoto Protocol. So a job well done for President Obama.
That was Mark Morano of Climate Depot. Naomi Klein, in your book, This Changes Everything, you talk about him. In fact, you talk about a number of these groups. You open with them in a chapter called The Right is Right.
Okay, well, let's be clear. They are not right about the science. They're wrong about the science. But I think what the right understands, and it's important to understand that the climate change denier movement in the United States is entirely a product of the right-wing think tank infrastructure. The groups like Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, which people mostly only know in terms of the fact that it hosts these annual conferences of climate change skeptics or deniers. it's important to know that the Heartland Institute is first and foremost a free market think tank. It's not a scientific organization. It is just like the other ones I listed. It exists to push the ideology, the familiar ideology of deregulation, privatization, cuts to government spending, and sort of triumphant free market, backed with enormous corporate funding, because that's a very, very profitable ideology. And when I interviewed the head of the Heartland Institute, Joe Bass, for this project, he was quite open that it wasn't that he found a problem with the science first. He said when he looked at the science and listened to what scientists were saying about how much we need to cut our emissions, he realized that climate change could be, if it were true, it would justify huge amounts of government regulation, which he politically opposes. And so he said, so then we looked at the science and we found these problems, right? So the issue is, they understand that if the science is true, their whole ideological project falls apart. Because as I said, you can't respond to a crisis this big that involves transforming the foundation of our economy. Our economy was built on fossil fuels. It is still fueled by fossil fuels. The idea, and this we hear this from a lot of liberal environmental groups, that we can change completely painlessly, just change your light bulbs, or just a gentle market mechanism, tax and relax, no problem. This is what they understand well, that in fact it requires transformative change. That change is abhorrent to them. They see it as the end of the world. It's not the end of the world, but it is the end of their world. It's the end of their ideological project. So that is unthinkable from Mark Morano's perspective and Joe Bass' perspective. So rather than think about that, they deny the science. So when I say the right is right, I think that they have a better grasp on the political implications of the science, of what it means to how we need to change our economy, and what the role of the public sphere is, and the role of collective action is. Better than some of those sort of big, slick, centrist green groups that are constantly trying to sell climate action as something entirely reconcilable with a booming capitalist economy. And we're always hearing about green growth and how it's great for business. Yeah, there will be markets and green energy and so on, but other businesses are going to have to contract in ways that requires that strong intervention.
But how do they then deal with nations like Germany, where there has been significant government intervention as a result of citizen protests? Germany is now close to 25% renewable energy, as a model where even within the bounds of some kinds of regulated capitalism, it is possible to make substantial change.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I have a fair bit about Germany in the book, and one of the arguments I make in the book is, if you look at which countries have adopted climate action, of a significant kind, there's a strong correlation between countries that have a social democratic tradition, that have not fully embraced deregulated capitalism, and are willing to intervene in these ways and protect the public sphere, and that green transition. You see that in the Scandinavian countries. They've always had some of the greenest policies. I'm not saying they're perfect. You've got Norway, which has become a petro-state, but you also have some amazing examples like Denmark, and then with Germany, Germany, even though it prescribes strict neoliberal austerity programs on countries like Greece and so on, Germany has never been a full neoliberal state, and this is a legacy of the Second World War. They have a strong social safety net. So Merkel, under pressure from Germany has probably the strongest environmental movement in the world, and in particular a very strong anti-nuclear movement. And they demanded this transition, and under pressure from the left opposition parties working with the government, they introduced this incredible energy transformation that has shown us, if we have the right policies in place, and they have a bold national feed-in tariff program that has encouraged decentralized renewable energy, we can change very quickly. And this is the number you cited is correct. 25% of Germany's energy now comes from renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, much of it small scale and decentralized. But here's the catch, and this is where you see the clash of ideologies, even in a country like Germany that is willing to put these incentives in place. Germany's emissions have gone up last year, the year before, and that's kind of remarkable. How could that be in the midst of this transition? Well, it's going up because Merkel has been unwilling to break the cardinal rule. She's been unwilling to say no to the fossil fuel companies. So the coal lobby, which is very strong in Germany, has been permitted to continue to dig up lignite coal, which is the dirtiest of the coals, and to export that energy, even though the demand for it is going down in Germany. So this is why it isn't just about saying yes, although it is about saying yes to the energy that we want and putting those right incentives and policies in place. We also have to say no to the kinds of energy that we don't want. And this is why you look at Obama, you know, who just for 3 years has been spinning his wheels over the Keystone XL pipeline. He just can't bring himself to just say no to this project that, you know, has so many liabilities and isn't necessary to fuel the U.S. economy. But it just seems like the word no just can't seem to escape his mouth. And this is what it means to have politicians who are products, really, of this deregulatory age.
But meanwhile, as he talks about global warming under Obama, as you note in your book, there's been an explosion in oil production right here in the United States, and the enormous amount of carrying of rail freight that now carries oil across the country.
Yeah, at tremendous risk. Yeah, I mean, this is the point, is it's not, you know, we sometimes talk about business as usual or doing nothing. It's worse than that. We're doing exactly the wrong things. We are doubling down. We're in the midst of a fossil fuel frenzy in North America.
Let's go to President Obama. This is him in 2012 when he appeared in Cushing, Oklahoma, to announce his support for TransCanada to build the southern leg of its Keystone oil pipeline from Oklahoma to Texas.
Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. So we are drilling all over the place right now. That's not the challenge. That's not the problem. In fact, the problem in a place like Cushing is that we're actually producing so much oil and gas in places like North Dakota and Colorado that we don't have enough pipeline capacity to transport all of it to where it needs to go.
That was President Obama, 2012, in Oklahoma, announcing his support for TransCanada. Now, Naomi, you're a Canadian journalist and activist. Your first arrest was outside President Obama's house, the White House, protesting the Keystone XL. Talk about what he's saying there.
Well, it's interesting, and you know, yeah, I was arrested with more than 1,000 other people. It was a huge act of civil disobedience, and you know, it's so interesting because we need huge infrastructure investments, and we're making the wrong ones. You know, I mean, if we're going to double down on fracking in the way that Obama policies have advocated, we're building. They want to build these huge export terminals. These infrastructure projects are billion-dollar projects, right? This is money that isn't going into the renewable energy infrastructure that we need to roll out wind and solar, and we know we can do it. I mean, we have research out of Stanford University by Mark Jacobson that is saying 100% renewable energy is within our grasp. But you know, when you double down on the fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, then it starts to compete with renewable energy. It's not just, you know, at all of the above. It takes away the market. And we are at this moment where we're seeing the tremendous potential of these technologies. And there's sort of a temptation among free marketeers in this country to just sort of like, look, you know, the price of solar is going down so fast, we can just leave this to the market. The problem is these fossil fuel companies are so rich. They don't just, you know, have money to burn, they have money to bribe. They've basically bought the whole political system. So they have the ability to undercut the rollout in all kinds of ways, you know, using groups like ALEC, imposing taxes on renewable energy. So they're fighting this at every turn, precisely because decentralized renewable energy, you know, it's really a different economic model than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are, they're inherently centralized, and you need a lot of infrastructure to get them out, and you need a lot of infrastructure to transport it, as Obama was explaining in front of all that pipe, right? Whereas renewable energy is everywhere. You know, the wind and sun and waves, they're free. So almost anybody can become an energy provider, and this is the German model of the feed-in tariff. You can feed into the grid and become an energy producer as well as provide your own energy. So what the big fossil fuel companies understand is that this means that millions of people become competitors with them. And some people talk about fossil fuels as the energy of the 1% or even less, and renewable energy, if done right, if done in a really decentralized way, can be the energy of the 99%. And that's what's exciting, and that's an example of how responding to this crisis we can deal with our two biggest crises, or two of our biggest crises at the same time. We can avert catastrophic climate change, and we can tackle inequality. And this is the reason why Germany has been so successful, is that because it's decentralized, and this is the piece of the transformation we often don't hear about, is that there have been 900 energy cooperatives created. Hundreds of cities and towns have decided to take back control over their energy grids from private operators that had privatized them in the 90s, so that they not only have renewable energy, but they keep the proceeds from that. They capture that rather than having it go into the pockets of shareholders, and they use it to fund their services. So the money stays close to home. So you're fighting austerity, you're fighting inequality, and you're fighting climate change at the same time. So there are all these sort of triple wins when we tackle this crisis. You see it in the food system too. We would decentralize our food system, have healthier food and lower emissions, and it is good for the economy. It's just a different kind of economy, and the old economy is so profitable for the few that they're trying to block action at every turn. And this is why it's not hopeful, by the way, when the Ban Ki-moon and the UN announce how great it is that they have, hundreds of Fortune 500 CEOs coming to the UN summit to solve climate change for us, because this is not the model that they're going to be interested in.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about that the whole issue of how corporations are trying to, in essence, co-opt or take over the environmental movement. You deal a lot with the big greens as opposed to the people's environmental movement. Mm-hmm. Specifically, this whole issue of offsets. And of some of the major organizations like the Wildlife Conservation Society and others actually being involved in helping to promote exploitation under the guise of environmental enlightenment.
Well, okay, so in the 70s and 80s, up until 1980, really, when the Superfund Act was introduced, the motto was polluter pays, right? It was, okay, you're the one doing the polluting. There's going to be penalties, and you're going to pay for the cleanup. That was the working principle, and that was the thinking behind many of the big environmental wins of the 60s and 70s. What happened in the 80s is that there was a shift, an ideological shift, along with the broader ideological shift in society in the era of Reagan and Thatcher. There was a shift from polluter pays to polluter plays, okay, to let's sit across the table from Walmart and McDonald's and Shell and BP and we'll come up with a solution together. We will convince them that acting to protect the environment it helps their bottom line, is good for business. And this was, what I get into in the book is trying to understand how this could have happened, right? Because it was a really bad idea. You can point, for instance, to Walmart. It is true that Walmart saves money by introducing energy efficiency, and it is true that Walmart will do just about anything to save money. We know that about Walmart. But we also know that Walmart, it will expand as rapidly as it possibly can. So at the same time as its energy intensity has gone down, because it has introduced efficiency measures with the help of groups like the Environmental Defense Fund, with whom it has partners, its emissions are still soaring because it is expanding so rapidly. So the net effect is still significantly negative, but yet they get held up by many of these green groups as a sustainability leader.
You break news and this changes everything. Like, for example, talk about what the Nature Conservancy is doing drilling. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Nature Conservancy is it's the largest green group in the world. They operate in dozens of countries, and I was interested in them because as Juan was mentioning offsets. because of this partnership model that took hold in the 1980s, when attention turned to solving the climate crisis at the end of the 80s and in the 90s, the question that was asked was, okay, how do we solve this crisis in a way that is win-win? And win-win meant in a way that is good for business and good for the environment. That was the starting assumption, right? So what's good for business is to be allowed to continue emitting if you offset those emissions somewhere in the world. And sometimes this theory is called the low-hanging fruit theory, meaning let's do the easy stuff first, okay? The problem with this theory is that essentially what these groups are saying is it's hard to take on Shell, you know? It's hard to take on BP. It's hard to take on the big coal companies. And it's easy to buy, you know, land from indigenous people who aren't politically powerful on the other side of the world and make them promises about how it's going to make them rich. And so there have been, you know, scandal after scandal in the, you know, in the carbon offset industry where people essentially feel their land is being grabbed. Once you decide that, you know, a forest is going to be a carbon offset, is going to be a sink, then somebody needs to guard those trees so people lose access to their land. There's all kinds of problems with the offset model. But the biggest problem, because I do think there can be a progressive way of compensating some of the poorest people in the world for doing what they're already doing, which is protecting the land. I think there is a way of doing that. The problem is it shouldn't be happening so that, you know, a coal company here can continue burning coal and giving kids asthma in some of the poorest areas in this country. So the problem is the interplay between allowing the emitters to continue doing what they're doing and using that as using offsets as a rationale. So yeah, the Nature Conservancy has been probably the world's biggest advocate of the offset model as a solution to climate change. And I was preparing for an interview with their top official who ended up canceling at the last minute. But over the course of this research, I came across a story from 2003 in the Washington Post about how there was all kinds of sort of dodgy things happening at the Nature Conservancy with land deals. And one of the things that the Washington Post discovered was that on a piece of land in Texas that the Nature Conservancy had acquired, actually been donated by Mobil at the time, called Mobil, now ExxonMobil, to save one of the most endangered species in the world, the Atwater prairie chicken. After they had taken control of the land, they had decided to drill for gas on that land themselves. And there was a big scandal about this, and the Nature Conservancy announced that they wouldn't be doing this anymore. You would think that an environmental group would not have to say that they won't drill for gas on a piece of land that is supposedly preserved for one of the most endangered species, but they actually made that a policy. But there was some small print, which is, you know, unless we have to respect an ongoing contract. My researcher, Rajiv Sikora, came across this document online, which was a paper that was presented at a petroleum conference, an engineering conference, that was quite recent, where somebody from the Nature Conservancy was talking about how they had a well in Texas, and they were claiming that this was the most sort of environmentally sensitive oil well. And it became clear as we dug into it that they were still drilling for oil, and in fact had drilled a new well. So yeah, that to me was one of the most shocking revelations in the book, was to discover that the largest green group in the world itself is operating or has contracted out oil and gas drilling
and the
on a nature
species have disappeared from that area.
Yeah, all the Atwater prairie chickens are gone from that piece of land. And according to the Nature Conservancy, there's no connection between their drilling activity and the disappearance of the birds. There's a debate about that among conservationists. But you know, the very idea that a group that is supposedly fighting climate change could itself be drilling for oil and gas. So they started off mostly getting gas, and now it's mostly oil coming out of the well. You know, even, you know, they say that they're locked in. That contract requires that they do that. And I guess the question I'm asking is, you know, have they really fought as hard as they possibly can to get out of that contract? But more importantly, what does this tell us about how close parts of the environmental movement have become to the oil and gas industry. Now, this is really changing, and now we have a whole new wave of environmental activists who are demanding the divestment of fossil fuel holdings from their schools, their religious institutions, their cities. So there is a whole new wave of environmentalism that is, I think, partially responding to these cozy relationships with the big green groups with the polluters.
We're going to talk about what's happening inside the UN on Tuesday, and then what's happening outside this weekend with what's expected to be the largest climate march in history. When we come back, we're talking to the journalist and activist Naomi Klein. Her new book is out this week. It's called This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. Stay with us. Do It Now, Sing for the Climate. Special thanks to Be Electric Studios for that footage of climate activists building a 300-foot banner for Monday's Flood Wall Street action, which we will talk about in a moment. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest for the hour is Naomi Klein. Yes, author of No Logo, author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Now she's out with a new book. Seems like you get a 7-year itch, Naomi. Every 7 years, 2000 No Logo, 2007 Shock Doctrine. Now it's 2014. This changes everything. Juan?
Well, Naomi, I wanted to follow up what we were talking about just before the break, this new generation of activists who are now challenging the old big green establishment groups. You write in the book, resistance to high-risk extreme extraction is building a global grassroots and broad-based network, the likes of which the environmental movement has rarely seen. And you give it a name, Blockadia.
Yeah,
Could you talk about Blockadia and what it means?
Well, Blockadia is a term that was first coined by activists in fighting the Keystone XL pipeline in Texas, that piece of pipe that Obama was proudly standing in front of, because they did go ahead and build that, and people tried to stop it with their bodies, and they called their camps Blockadia. And what I argue in the book is Blockadia is really this transnational space, roving space, where regular people are stepping in where our leaders are failing, and they're trying to stop this era of extreme extraction with their bodies or in the courts, particularly Indigenous people, First Nations people, using their traditional land rights, their treaties, their Aboriginal title to take on massive corporations and to take on the Canadian government, the U.S. government, and winning some really significant victories. This often gets called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. But there's the French anti-fracking activists have a slogan, ni ici, ni ailleurs, not here or anywhere. Right? And that's really the spirit of it. It's drawing the line. And you often hear that slogan, whether people are fighting pipelines or fighting fracking or coal export terminals up and down the Pacific Northwest. And these, there have been real victories. Whole countries have passed fracking moratoriums. Like France, you have the province of Quebec, New York State, which is, people are fiercely trying to defend the fracking moratorium. You have really strong movements opposing LNG export terminals, and and there's what people are doing is identifying the choke points. So a mine gets approved in Montana to open up a huge new coal mine. But because demand for coal is dropping in the U.S., this coal needs to be exported. So you've got to build a railway. You've got to build huge export terminals. And at every point there in this process, there's huge opposition. And so, this, in the book I write about the Otter Creek mine in Montana, it may very well not get built, not because they were able to block the mining permit, but because they're blocking the construction of the railway and the export. It's very hard to get the coal out because all along the Pacific Northwest, you have such strong opposition. And this is, it's really the flip side of this carbon boom, this fossil fuel frenzy. These companies have become, so ravenous to get every last drop of fossil fuels out of the ground. They're going to places, and they're having to go to places where they don't have as much political power as the places they're used to operating, right? So you go to the Pacific Northwest, it's not Texas, I mean, these are places where there's a very, very strong and militant environmental tradition. This is where Earth First was born. This is a history of tree sits and logging that way. You also have resurgent indigenous rights movements.
And you mentioned also the fight to preserve the forests in Greece. That's become a national cause in Greece.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is something we filmed for the documentary. That's my partner Abby Lewis is going to be coming out in a few months with a documentary that in many ways is a companion to the book. It's not an adaptation of the book, because we did it sort of in a parallel process. And I'm really excited about the documentary because in a way that a book can't. The documentary really shows the vibrancy of these resistance movements, and people are speaking with their own powerful voices. And one of the most inspiring movements that we were lucky enough to document was this movement against a massive open-pit gold mine in northern Greece, in Halkidiki, and it's become a huge national symbol. And it's part of, I think it's more than a resistance movement against fossil fuels. I think it's a resistance movement against the whole logic of extractivism, the whole idea that we need to create sacrifice zones in order to have a healthy economy. And the shift is towards a regenerative economy, and an economy that takes care of the land, in which no one, no people and no place needs to be sacrificed in the name of progress. And it was extraordinarily powerful, and to see that. And it was also, Greece is the country being hit hardest by austerity, and in the name of economic crisis, we hear about how pensions are being cut, salaries are being cut, but it's also the natural environment that is being thrown under the bus in Greece in the name of economic progress. And in the face of that, people are redefining what progress means.
Let's talk about what's happening first on Sunday, then on Monday. It's being billed as the largest climate march in history. Talk about what's happening here in New York and also around the world. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm really excited about the march on Sunday, and I'm sure some of the core local organizers could talk about it better than me. But I've been lucky, to as I'm on the board of 350, and been board of 350 is 350 is the environmental organization, 350.org.
Yeah, and 350 is part of the coalition behind the march, but there's just hundreds of groups, and I think the most exciting part of it to me is that I think this is going to be the most diverse environmental demonstration maybe ever seen in North America. And I think that this idea of climate activism being this thing that only sort of slick NGOs do. And you've seen this, at the summits, and it's really not going to be like that. I mean, and I think it's really significant that this is happening in post-Hurricane Sandy, New York, because there's the connection between the imperative to fight inequality, to have economic and racial justice, and to fight climate change, the connections between these projects and these values were so clear in the midst, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, because you saw how different the experience of the storm was if you were wealthy and had private responses, or if you were relying on the state, or if you were in public housing. It was an entirely different experience. And so I think for a lot of people in this city, these are not abstract issues. They live it. They know it. And so there's going to be a different kind of climate movement on the streets, with it's going to be a lot of people who are not sort of looking down at the globe from space. I have a part of the book about the problem of the imagery of the environmental movement being the astronaut's eye view of the Earth. And, it's a beautiful blue planet, but it gets really fuzzy and abstract from way up there. It really is, it's the God's eye view of the world. This is a movement that is really, it's down in the dirt, and we're going to see Blockadia in force. We're going to see the anti-fracking movement, the anti-pipeline movement, the people fighting mountaintop removal, coal mining, people with refineries in their backyards. So yeah, there are going to be NGOs participating, but I think what's really different about this is it's just going to feel a lot more immediate.
Well, in line with the breadth of the movement as it's growing, I was in my column in the Daily News yesterday. I reported on a lot of the unions, the labor unions that are organizing people to come out. 1199, the hospital workers, is bringing over several thousand of its members. And I asked one of the leaders, why are you getting involved in this at this stage? And they said, well, we've got members. We've got members who come from Guyana who are facing rising sea levels in their country. We've got lots of thousands of Filipino nurses that are part of our union, and they've just been had to deal with what happened in their home country with the typhoon, and so that this is something that strikes directly at our members and their understanding of what's happening in the world.
It's also, I think it's even more than that, which is that if we're serious about getting off fossil fuels and having a more deliberate economy where we contract those parts of our economy that are responsible for soaring emissions, then we need to also expand those parts of our economy that are lower emissions, and that includes healthcare, that includes education, and these are sectors that are in crisis where we need these massive investments. So I think climate change, if we're going to respond to it seriously, because it is a health crisis, and also because this is one of those. This is a real win-win where we can invest in services that make people's lives better and are also low carbon. I think that's why healthcare workers get this. They get this, but so do transit workers unions. And there's tensions within the labor movement, and we have a long way to go. But that's going to be a big part of the march.
I want to ask about what's happening on Monday. The direct action called Flood Wall Street. This is one of the action's organizers, David Solna.
Now I think the next step for the climate movement is realizing that the fossil fuel industry is just the tip of the iceberg of the economic system that is hardwired to produce climate change, be bad for democracy, be bad for community. So we're going to take the next step during this, the day after the march, and actually take it to Wall Street and say, we actually need to replace this whole economic system of corporate capitalism. We have the pieces to replace it. We have the know-how. We have the alternatives. We just need to build a big, loud movement that has the capacity to actually shift and make the changes needed to address climate change. So we're gonna be on Wall Street with thousands of people, and a lot of us are going to sit down and refuse to move, even if that means risking arrest. And we invite everybody to join us if you care about the future, care about the climate, and care about democracy.
So that is Monday after the big march on Sunday, and that's Wall Street. You're actually going to be speaking there, Naomi.
Yeah, I'm going to be speaking there when people start gathering at Battery Park. And Sunday is a big family-friendly march, and everybody, I think will feel safe participating in that, and there is a desire to, and I think a big message at Sunday's march is urgency. There's going to be a sounding of the climate alarm, and precisely because of what we were talking about earlier, because of this impossible cognitive dissonance that we're living, where on the one hand we're being told this is emergency, and on the other hand we're being told to double down on the cause of the emergency. So because we don't have climate leaders gathering at the UN, we have climate failures gathering at the UN, and some of them aren't even showing up. Like my Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, is such a climate criminal that he's decided to skip the whole thing, and he's just showing up for the dinner afterwards. So there's going to be that sense of urgency expressed in the streets, and then I think people are going to take it one step further on Monday with Flood Wall Street. And also, as David said, take it to the people who are really responsible for blocking progress and make those connections. A lot of the people who are involved in organizing Flood Wall Street I first met them in the context of Occupy Wall Street, and they understand that this is an economic system that is sacrificing people in the name of profit. They already knew that. What climate change tells us is this same logic of profit and growth above all else is sacrificing the very life systems that we all depend on, and that's an obvious connection to make, and it supercharges our movements with existential urgency. And this isn't about a brand new movement. It's about all of our movements coming together.
Naomi Klein, I want to thank you for being with us. We're doing part 2 of this interview, and then we'll be broadcasting it on Democracy Now! Naomi's new book is out. This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. Democracy Now! Will be covering the climate march on Sunday from 10:30 to 1:30 Eastern Time. Go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Felser, Armante Nirmi, Sheikh Steve Martinez, Sanal Kakani, Masood Rabi, Karen Dina Gesder, Amy Littlefield. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.